On 18th June 1980, I conducted an interview with Isamu Noguchi in New York City. He was amongst the artists I was researching for my doctoral thesis on the response of American artists to Asian thought and art, and perhaps the only one I wanted to talk to who was actually listed in the New York City telephone directory. I called him from a phone at Penn Station, and the conversation went well. Although as a graduate student I was low on the totem pole, it was a very large totem pole called history that I was part of. And perhaps by that point in his life, in the second half of his 8th decade, he was beginning to think in a more concentrated way about his place in the historical record. He seemed genuinely interested in responding to my questions, despite my phone call having come out of the blue as an interruption to his work. And after a certain point, he asked me where I was calling from, and having ascertained that I was within range of his studio in Long Island City, he urged me to get into a taxi straight away and come over to talk face to face. When I got there, I realized he was busy in a meeting with his staff, but after he had introduced me to them, we withdrew to another room to continue our conversation, and later we went down to his garden to view and discuss his outdoor sculpture there. Although I was vaguely aware of Baisha's work at that point and knew from A Sculptor's World, that's Noguchi's autobiography, that he had learnt from him in Beijing in 1930, I had no questions about that artist to raise myself, concentrating rather on the issue of Japanese sources for Noguchi's art. Nevertheless, Noguchi considered that his time with Baisha was important enough for him to bring it up in our conversation without prompting from me. And he only brought that avenue of discussion to a halt when he realized he was talking about something which was largely outside my knowledge and certainly my direct visual experience. Thus, my ignorance prevented me from finding out more about the importance of that artistic encounter for him. In 1986, I moved from my native England to work in Hong Kong, and since then, I've become a lot more familiar with the paintings of Baisha. Apart from the opportunities I've had over the years to see his work in museum settings, I also encounter them ever more frequently in auctions of 20th century Chinese art. Chinese art of the last 100 years is now receiving a great deal more attention than it used to, at least from collectors and at least in Asia. And the total value of sales of Qi's work at auction in 2011 apparently exceeded that achieved by both Andy Warhol and Pablo Picasso. As part of this shift in awareness concerning Chinese art and taking advantage of my geographical location, I have worked since my arrival in Hong Kong on the other half of the story to that which had preoccupied me when I was writing my PhD thesis, namely the response of modern Asian, or more specifically Chinese artists, to Western art. I've been seeking, in this broader, less Western-centered focus for my work, to look at the question of cross-cultural encounter in a less culturally narrow way, and thus work towards breaking down to some degree the cultural compartmentalization which still plagues the field of art history. This is not a matter, I feel, of finding some ideal panoptic viewpoint from which the whole of world art history can be understood. Such a viewpoint, if jumped to too quickly, could, I believe, simply end up reinscribing a Western perspective on art history in a new way. Instead, I seek to acknowledge that there are multiple geographic perspectives from which art history needs to be written at this moment in time, each of which can, at least in principle, address the art of the whole world. Each will need to be aware of other perspectives that are being articulated and be prepared to engage with them where differences of interpretation are at stake, to critique each other's blind spots, but none can be granted any priority in advance. In addition to seeking a globalization of art history in this way, and using, in my own case at least, the issue of cross-cultural encounter as a way to move forward towards a more open or connected conception of art history, I'm also interested in exploring the possibility of writing that tries to cover a wider time frame than is often the case. To do this enables one to put both modern and contemporary art in the same frame, for instance, thereby enabling more recent art to be treated with a historical understanding it doesn't always receive. I have particular problems with the notion of contemporary art as a category, finding it lacking in historical sense, since it doesn't attempt to characterize from outside a particular period in the way that the term modern at least does, and simply denotes an ever-shifting present moment whose art is often valorized as more worthy than that produced at other points in time. Although contemporary Chinese art is widely exhibited in Europe and North America today, Chinese modernism is much less commonly found on museum walls, at least as part of permanent collections attempting to enunciate a grand narrative of artistic modernism. Without a more expansive temporal perspective that maps Chinese modernism and other non-Western modernisms as part of that larger story of modernism in general, there will be no questioning of the Western-centeredness of both textbook and museum narratives of artistic modernity. Adding works by contemporary Chinese artists at the end of that story is one thing, but it would be wholly another to move the Picassos and the Mondrians down the wall to make way for the Fu Baoshis and the Qi Baishis. As part of this project of taking a longer temporal perspective on the issue of cross-cultural artistic encounter, I want in the time left to me today to look briefly at two cases from quite different moments in history. One dates from approximately the same time as Noguchi's 1930 encounter with Qi Baishi in Beijing, and the other extends the discussion back to a significantly earlier moment in the late 18th century, thereby enabling us to consider the way in which the possibilities of cross-cultural artistic encounter is affected by the historical era in which it occurs. In both cases, I'll be looking at a Chinese artist who traveled to the West, one to England and one to the United States. Both, like Noguchi, were sculptors. In each of the two cases, there is something to be said about cross-cultural encounter occurring in China as well as in the West, thus offering a geographically wider story that is not easily captured in standalone histories of either Western or Chinese art, which is equally the case when trying to understand the encounter of Noguchi and Qi Baishi, or indeed other aspects of the artistic life of Noguchi, spanning as it does more than one continent. The first case I want to discuss is that of the portrait modeler known as Chikwa, who owned a store in Canton, modern-day Guangzhou, where, we are told, he made portraits of visiting Western traders and mariners. As one of the smaller independent merchants specializing in trade with foreigners, and presumably having his business in the relatively tiny area to which these overseas visitors were restricted when resident, he would have had the opportunity to develop a comparatively deep first-hand understanding of aspects of Western culture. Contact with Westerners was also happening in 18th century Peking because of the presence of the Jesuit missionaries at the Qing court, but Canton was a prime site for sophisticated cross-cultural interaction, as a story told by visitor William Hickey attests. Hickey records attending a dinner hosted by the merchant Pan Kikwa for a mixture of Chinese and Western guests on the 1st of October 1769, which was, in his words, dressed and served à la mode anglaise, with everyone expected to use knives and forks. This was followed by a Chinese-style dinner on the very next night, where all were required to use chopsticks. Clearly, this pair of evenings was a self-conscious performance of cross-cultural knowledge on the host's part, displaying his cosmopolitan sophistication and presenting alternately one or the other section of his guests with a challenge concerning the mastery of dining implements, which they may not have wholly met. After each dinner was a performance in the appropriate cultural style for this cross-cultural audience, with the English one involving a Chinese actor making a comic impersonation of an Englishman. Pan Kikwa was clearly displaying his understanding of Western culture in order to enhance his personal prestige and thus consolidate his position as one of the leading merchants in the city's international trade. And in a not-so-showy way, the less socially exalted trader, Chikwa, would also have been exploiting his cross-cultural capital for personal gain. Most of the trade at Canton was in bulk commodities such as tea, which already had a ready market and an established connoisseurship within China itself. But as a portrait sculptor, Chikwa was making personally, as opposed to simply buying in bulk, novel items for which there was no direct previously existing counterpart in China. Since he was making portraits, he furthermore needed to satisfy individual clients as end users and had to display sufficient understanding of their sense of self to do so. Whereas the bigger merchants employed specialist linguists for their communication with foreigners, Chikwa would have needed to have language abilities in China Coast Pidgin or elementary English to communicate directly himself with clients. And thus his language skills would probably have been pretty exceptional when compared to almost anyone else in China. Presumably, as a result of contacts made through his trade, Chikwa took a decision to travel to London, arriving in 1769 on the East Indiaman Horsenden. He was to stay till around 1772, becoming the first Chinese artist to visit the West and one of the first Chinese visitors to Britain altogether. Aided by his language skills and his relative maturity, he might have been in his early 40s at the time, he lived independently, taking lodgings near the Strand in central London, and pursued his existing business of making small portrait figurines in this novel environment, using a stock of clay that he apparently brought with him. Not only was he able to work at his existing trade while in London, he was to experience great success with it, being able to charge as much as 15 guineas for a figurine, which is about 3/4 the annual salary of a cook maid at that time. Whatever the status of his work within China itself, in England he was treated by artists as their professional peer, being invited to a grand dinner held by the Royal Academy on 23rd of April 1770 in the great room of their building on the south side of Pall Mall. He was even to appear in Johann Zoffany's oil painting, The Academicians of the Royal Academy of 1771-2, which documents the members of this new body. He's the only figure wearing a hat. He's found tucked away at the back on the left side. I don't really have a pointer, so just to let you know. A sense that he is a member of this convivial grouping and not an outsider is created by Zoffany's depiction of the miniature painter Jeremiah Mayer turning to him in conversation. In addition to this symbolic inclusion in the British artistic community, Chikwa was also allowed to exhibit a work, now lost or at least unidentified, described as a portrait of a gentleman, a model, in the Second Royal Academy exhibition in 1770. By a long lead, therefore, Chikwa became the first named Chinese artist to have a work shown in an overseas exhibit. This professional success was paralleled by a certain social celebrity. Chikwa was to meet various well-known figures of the age, such as James Boswell and Josiah Wedgwood, and was even introduced to King George and Princess Augusta. While a number of works survive which could be by Chikwa's hand, there is only one where we have a high degree of confidence concerning authorship, and this is a seated portrait of Dr. Anthony Askew, which is in the collection of the Royal College of Physicians in London. The figure, made in unbaked clay, subsequently painted, is around 13 inches in height and leaves us with a definite sense of an individualized portrait, not only because of the degree of definition of the features and the effort that has gone into fashioning a coherent facial expression, but also because the whole body pose reads as expressive of character. Askew wears a red medical doctor's robe, and there is a great deal of attention to the details of his dress and accessories, including his cane, a common badge of medical office at that time. The cane is actually also in the collection of the Royal College of Physicians. Askew's prominent stomach helps give a sense of corporeality, that's ensuring the clothes do not overwhelm the figure beneath them. It is worth noting that Chikwa's success in London was achieved without him having to make a spectacle of his Chineseness, at least with respect to his art. Commentators do not comment on any Chineseness in his works and seem to have no expectation of anything exotic from them. In this work, only the rock on which Askew is perched has anything overtly Chinese about it. In an age before British imperial ambitions toward China had matured, and in which the racial theory, whose consequences for intercultural interaction we still face today, had not yet fully developed, contacts between cultures were, it seems, differently configured. The second Chinese sculptor visiting the West who I wish to briefly consider is Teng Guai, also known in China by his pen name, Teng Baiye. Born near the start of the 20th century, Teng was to travel in 1924 to Seattle, where he completed master's level study at the University of Washington. Traveling more than a century after Chikwa, as part of a wave of Chinese students seeking art education in the West, he focused on acquiring skills as a sculptor, and his success in that respect is evidenced by his being appointed to teach at the university in the 1927-8 academic year. Perhaps this was the first occasion a Chinese artist had taught art at a Western university. And although Teng, unlike Chikwa, had arrived in the West to learn rather than simply to make use of pre-existing skills, he was to be an exporter of Chinese culture as well as an importer of Western modes. In addition to practicing sculpture where his skills were firmly within a Western mold, Teng was an ink painter specializing in the specifically Chinese tradition of finger painting. This is an example. His works were exhibited at various locations in the United States, including one-person shows at the Henry Gallery in Seattle, the 20th Century Club in Boston, and the Renaissance Society at the University of Chicago. He lectured widely on Chinese art and culture, helped with the creation of a diorama with wax figurines depicting Marco Polo before Kubla Khan in the Brooklyn Children's Museum, and designed the Chinese room or Chinese classroom for the University of Pittsburgh's Cathedral of Learning on the right-hand side. When Chikwa was in London, he was invited to examine the collection of Chinese books at the British Museum. And even in the early 20th century, a knowledgeable native informant on Chinese culture was a scarce resource in the West, it seems. Amongst those who benefited from Teng's knowledge concerning Chinese art and culture was the Seattle-based painter Mark Tobey, who had met Teng by 1926 at the latest, and who received lessons in Chinese brushwork from him at some point in the 1920s. A little earlier than Noguchi was to learn from Chibaisha in Beijing then, another American artist was to find inspiration from study with a Chinese painter. And although the effects of his artistic development were to be a long time in fully manifesting themselves, they were to be profound in their implications. Tobey imbibed from Teng not simply a technique, although certain of his later works, such as this example, I'm sorry it's only in black and white reproduction, Written Over the Plains #2 of 1959, some of these later works do show gestural linear marks which recall Chinese brushwork. But it's something more than that. It's also a way of looking at the world that he's learning. He mentions, Tobey, at one point how after a session with Teng, he came out and saw a tree and the tree was no longer a solid. In this revelation, Tobey was picking up a distinction between Chinese and Western art that Teng himself chose to emphasize in a lecture titled Expressionism in Chinese Art, which he gave in Shanghai in 1934, following his return to China. Teng stated that in contrast to Western art, Chinese painting is lineal, whilst Western art is a massing of different colors to make a form. Teng was giving Tobey not just an experience of using the Chinese brush, but an intellectual context within which to interpret it. The dynamic linearity of Chinese brushwork had been a means for Tobey to become acquainted with the philosophical worldviews of Buddhism and Taoism, which emphasize process rather than substance. This dissolution of solid form aided Tobey beyond cubism and allowed the dynamic all-over webs of his mature abstract style, which is a precursor to similar traits in the works of Jackson Pollock and other abstract expressionist painters, and perhaps also an influence on them. Pollock's wife and widow, the painter Lee Krasner, confirmed to me in an interview that her husband was aware of Tobey's works. Perhaps the first work in which Toby's overall linear idiom is clearly displayed is Broadway Norm of 1935-6, a painting in tempera on paper, completed soon after his 1934 trip to China and Japan, during which he renewed his acquaintance with Teng, staying with him in Shanghai and continuing his study of Chinese calligraphy under his supervision. In this abstracted image, Broadway Norm, now sadly destroyed, all sense of solid mass is abolished in favor of an imagery of flux achieved through linear means. Although titled for the New York City Avenue, the work is arguably as much a response by Toby to the overwhelming experience of Shanghai. He had written while there in a letter of April 1934 about the language, the beautiful character writing, the unconventionality of life everywhere. And retrospectively, in 1951, he emphasized the dynamic nature of the city when describing it. Thousands of Chinese characters are twisting and turning. In every door is a shop. The rickshaws jostle the vendors, their backs hung with incredible loads. The whole scene is alive, Toby writes. The Chinese written language is emphasized in both these statements. And the second, interestingly, makes a punning reference to both the language and the people, in its reference to Chinese characters, as if pointing out the appropriateness of employing a visual language derived from Chinese calligraphy to represent the dynamic life of the city, as he does in Broadway Norm. Such an analogy could have been directly borrowed from Teng, who in his Shanghai Expressionism in Chinese Art lecture of 1934, apparently, according to a news report about it, dealt with lines, comparing them to all types of human beings, some muscular and powerful and abrupt, and others showing the signs of decadence. Indeed, Teng also made a punning reference to both Chinese writing and the famous personalities of Chinese history when he proposed Chinese characters as the first theme for the Pittsburgh Chinese classroom. Teng's influence on the development of American art was not known to his Chinese compatriots, and indeed he himself may not have been aware of the full impact of his lessons on Toby. Although he continued to exhibit his finger paintings after his return to China and made an important contribution to the development of modern Chinese sculpture through works such as Progress, which we see here, a nationalistically themed representation of a bare-chested laborer with a carrying pole who symbolically steps upwards. In fact, his artistic career was to falter significantly after the birth of the People's Republic in 1949. His overseas connections worked against him, as did an association with the institutions of the pre-war nationalist government. His art was denounced as spiritual pollution. Like so many other Chinese artists of his generation, his project of artistic national modernization was to be an incomplete one, out of favor with the new political climate. While cross-cultural artistic exchange has many positive benefits, it is often harder to integrate lessons learned overseas after one's return than it is to enjoy the experience of another culture, even in the best of times. Chikwa's story after his return to China, about which we know almost nothing, also alerts us to this, since the last news that we have of him is of his death by self-poisoning in 1796. In what way that end might have been influenced by the consequences of readjusting to life in China after a trip to the other end of the earth, we will probably never know, but it alerts us to consider that cross-cultural contact, no matter in what age it occurs, has potential risks as well as benefits. Thank you very much.